in 1847, a single letter, just a few sentences written by a prime minister, stopped the total financial annihilation of the British Empire. Before that letter arrived, 4 major banks had already died, 450 firms were disintegrating, and desperate men were walking into Hyde Park and never walking out again. The technology that caused it all? Steam. In a single week in October 1847, just 7 days, more British wealth was destroyed than in any military defeat of the 19th century. This was not a stock market crash. This was the unravelling of the British middle class, the economic spine of the largest empire on earth. Consols, the benchmark government bonds that were supposed to be the safest investment in the known world, were in freefall. Financiers who had dined with royalty were physically standing in the Chancellor's office, begging for rescue. One historian would later write that no other panic was ever so fatal to the middle class. Men stood in the trading halls of London with blank faces, watching fortunes built over generations vanish in hours. And the engine of all this destruction was not a war, was not a plague. It was a technology, one that everyone believed would change the world forever. They were right. It did change the world. But first, it nearly destroyed it. The technology was the railway, powered by steam, thundering iron machines that shrank the distance between cities from days to hours. A revolution in motion, in commerce, in human possibility. Everyone believed in it. Everyone invested in it. And that belief, that intoxicating, society-wide, unshakable belief, is exactly what made the crash so devastating. But here is the part that should make you uncomfortable, because right now, in the 2020s, we are watching the exact same pattern unfold: a revolutionary technology, explosive speculation, valuations that defy gravity, credit flooding the system, and a wall of over-optimism that refuses to acknowledge what history is screaming at us. Artificial intelligence is the steam engine of our era, and the question that should keep every investor awake at night is simple. So what exactly happened in 1847, and is 2026 going to rhyme? By the end of this video, you will know. You will learn about the fraudster who built a railway empire on lies, paying investors with their own money, and how his scheme is eerily mirrored by companies in the artificial intelligence sector today. You will discover how a law designed to prevent crisis actually guaranteed one, and why a similar policy trap may be closing around the current boom right now. And you will see how the panic ended, not with a bailout, not with a market correction, but with a single piece of paper that was never even used. Let me set the stage. If you are fascinated by the hidden patterns that repeat across history, the ones that can predict what is coming next, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the forces that shape our world. Now, let me take you back to 1840s Britain, a nation drunk on steam. In the 1840s, the British Empire was the most powerful force on the face of the earth. It was the workshop of the world. Its factories churned out steel, textiles, and machinery at a scale no other nation could match. Its navy ruled every ocean. Its colonies stretched across continents, from India to Canada, from the Caribbean to the southern Pacific. And London, its beating heart, was the undisputed financial capital of the planet. Capital flowed through its banking houses like blood through arteries, funding ventures and enterprises across the globe. But beneath this grandeur, Britain was sitting on a powder keg, and the fuse was already lit. Ireland, the empire's nearest colony, and its most neglected, was dying. The Great Famine had struck with biblical force. The potato blight had destroyed the staple food of millions. Entire villages were being emptied, not by emigration, but by starvation and disease. The British government, under enormous political pressure, was borrowing heavily to fund famine relief, and every pound spent on Irish aid was a pound drained from the financial reserves that underwrote London's banking system. Gold reserves at the Bank of England, which had stood at a comfortable £15 million, began their quiet, sickening slide. Within months, they would fall to 9 million. The empire's vault was bleeding, and almost nobody was paying attention, because almost everybody was looking somewhere else entirely. They were looking at steam. Imagine you have lived your entire life in a world where the fastest you can travel is the speed of a horse, where moving goods from Manchester to London takes days by canal barge, where information travels at the pace of a rider on a muddy road. Then, suddenly, machines are hurtling across the countryside at 30, 40, 50 miles per hour, iron locomotives pulling carriages full of passengers and freight, collapsing distances that had defined human life for millennia. The world is shrinking before your eyes. That is what steam did to the 1840s. Now ask yourself, does that sound familiar? For the Victorians, steam was their artificial intelligence. It was the technology that was going to change everything. And they were not wrong. They were just early and reckless. And this is where the madness begins. To understand the mania, you need to understand the people who drove it. Three forces converged to create the perfect speculative storm, and each one had a human face. The first was George Hudson. They called him the Railway King. Born the son of a Yorkshire farmer, raised in modest obscurity, Hudson inherited a small fortune from a great uncle and used it to claw his way into the railway business. He was charismatic, ruthless, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to make people believe in him. By the mid-1840s, he controlled a vast network of railway companies. He sat in Parliament. He entertained aristocrats. He was, for a dazzling moment, one of the most powerful men in England. But George Hudson had a secret, one that, when exposed, would trigger a chain reaction that brought an empire to its knees. The second was Sir Robert Peel, the Prime Minister who, in 1844, passed the Bank Charter Act. Peel was a man of principle, a fiscal conservative who believed in sound money. His act was designed to prevent reckless inflation by tying the issuance of banknotes directly to gold and silver reserves held by the Bank of England. The intent was noble: create a stable monetary foundation for the world's greatest economy. Peel believed he was building a fortress. He was building a cage. The third force had no single name. It was the crowd. This was not just aristocrats and bankers gambling on railway shares. Everyone was in. Clerks, shopkeepers, widows investing their late husbands' pensions, school teachers, retired military officers, even the sons of a charwoman, a cleaning lady, subscribed for £37,500 in railway stock, £37,500 in the 1840s, from the children of a woman who scrubbed floors for a living. That is not investment. That is collective hallucination. Thousands of miles of new railway track were being planned. Credit via loans and deposits expanded fivefold in just 2 years. New railway companies were launching with little more than a prospectus and a promise. But here is where the Bank Charter Act, Peel's great fortress, revealed its fatal flaw. The Act restricted the issuance of banknotes. If the Bank of England did not have gold in its vaults, it could not print paper currency. Simple, disciplined, logical. But the Act only restricted notes. It said nothing about loans or deposits. So the banks simply shifted the game. They did not print more notes. They extended more credit. Loans exploded. Deposits multiplied. The money supply ballooned through a back door the law never locked. This distinction between what the law controlled and what it did not would become the difference between stability and catastrophe. The pieces were all in place. A revolutionary technology, a society-wide gambling frenzy, a financial system with a hidden flaw, and a famine draining the reserves. The only question now was, when would the music stop? Between 1844 and 1846, railway mania reached its delirium. New railway companies were not just launching weekly, they were launching daily. Every town wanted a railway connection. Every investor wanted railway shares. Prospectuses promised impossible returns on lines that would never carry a single passenger. Share prices climbed vertically, defying every sober calculation of actual revenue potential. Railway stocks were not just investments, they were a religion. To doubt the railway was to doubt progress itself. To question whether a proposed line from some village in Norfolk to some hamlet in Shropshire would ever generate a profit was to mark yourself as a fool, a Luddite, a man on the wrong side of history. The national newspapers were filled with railway advertisements. Coffee houses buzzed with railway gossip. Dinner parties were consumed by railway speculation. The entire social fabric of Britain was rewoven around a single question: which railway shares should I buy next? Land prices along proposed routes skyrocketed. Towns that were nowhere near any proposed railway spent fortunes lobbying Parliament for connections. Engineers and surveyors could name their price. The printing presses ran day and night, churning out prospectuses thick with optimistic projections and thin on actual evidence. But here is what nobody wanted to hear. A handful of skeptics, and there were always a handful, pointed out that many of the planned routes were economically unviable, that the projected passenger and freight revenues were fantasies, that the sheer number of competing lines being built would guarantee that most could never turn a profit. They published pamphlets. They wrote letters to newspapers. They were ignored completely. Because when everyone is getting rich, the man who says, "This cannot last," is not a prophet. He is an annoyance. George Hudson sat at the center of this universe like a sun around which smaller bodies orbited. He controlled a vast network of railway companies spanning the north and Midlands of England. He sat in Parliament, wielding political influence alongside financial power. He dined with the Duke of Wellington. He entertained at his country estate with the confidence of a man who believed his own legend. But the Railway King's empire was built on sand. Hudson was paying dividends not from profits, but from new investors' capital. He was hiding account books from shareholders and board members. He was manipulating share registries, inflating the number of shares he personally held, and covering operating losses with fresh deposits. Running, in everything but name, a Ponzi scheme, powered by steam. Now, if this sounds familiar, if it reminds you of certain technology companies today that burn through cash while promising revolutionary futures, hold that thought. We will come back to it. And then the external shocks began. In March of 1847, the British government announced a massive loan, £8 million, to fund Irish famine relief. This was a moral necessity. Ireland was dying. Entire communities were being wiped from the map by starvation and typhus. The government had no choice. But financially, the loan was a body blow to an already strained system. Gold began hemorrhaging out of the Bank of England's vaults. Reserves that had stood at £15 million began their sickening slide toward £9 million. And it was not just the Irish loan. Harvest failures across continental Europe forced Britain to increase food imports, and each shipment of grain paid for in gold drained the reserves further. Capital was also flowing outward to investments in the United States. Speculative money chasing opportunity across the Atlantic, pulled by the gravitational force of American expansion. The Bank of England responded the only way it knew how. It raised interest rates, hoping to attract gold back to London by making British investments more appealing to foreign holders of bullion. This was textbook monetary policy. It was also, in the context of 1847, a death sentence, because higher interest rates did not just attract gold, they strangled credit. The very loans and deposits that had fueled the railway mania now became more expensive. Companies that had borrowed heavily to fund construction suddenly faced higher repayment costs. Investors who had bought shares on margin found their carrying costs climbing. The cheap money that had inflated the bubble was being sucked out of the system at exactly the moment the bubble needed it most. And yet, and this is the most dangerous phase of any bubble, the mania held. Despite the reserves draining, despite interest rates rising, people could not bring themselves to believe that railways, the future itself, could fail. This is not the peak of euphoria. The peak has already passed. This is something worse. This is the moment after the first cracks appear, when everyone collectively decides to ignore them. When the evidence of trouble is visible to anyone willing to look, but the cost of looking, of admitting that your investment might be worthless, that you might lose everything, is so psychologically devastating that denial becomes the only tolerable response. We see this pattern in every technology-driven bubble in history. The dot-com investors of 1999 who said this time it is different because the internet changes everything. The cryptocurrency evangelists of 2021 who insisted that blockchain would replace the entire traditional financial system. And right now, today, the artificial intelligence optimists who insist that trillion-dollar valuations are justified because the technology is real. And here is the thing. The technology is real. Steam railways were real. They did change the world. But that did not stop the bubble from destroying everyone who bet too much, too late. By the summer of 1847, the situation was a coiled spring. Gold reserves depleted, interest rates climbing, railway companies unable to meet their capital calls, share prices beginning to crack, investors realizing, with a cold and spreading horror, that they owed money they did not have on shares that were worth less every single day. The calls for additional installments kept arriving, the share certificates kept losing value, and the exits were getting smaller. The stage was set. What came next would be remembered as the most devastating financial week in 19th century British history. They called it the Week of Terror, and it was about to begin. Railway companies are failing their capital calls. Investors who subscribed for shares during the mania, who signed contracts committing to buy at prices that seemed reasonable when the market was soaring, are now being asked to pay installments they cannot afford on shares that are collapsing in value. Imagine you signed up to buy £1,000 in railway shares when the market was at its peak. You paid the first installment, perhaps £200, and watched the value climb. You felt brilliant. You felt rich. Now the shares are worth £600 and falling, but you still owe the remaining £800 in installments on the original contract price. You are trapped. You owe money on an asset that is melting in your hands, and there is no way out. You cannot sell the shares for what you owe. You cannot refuse to pay without being sued. You are watching your financial life collapse in slow motion. This was not an isolated tragedy. It was a cascade. Investors forced to cover railway calls sold other assets, government bonds, property, stakes in commercial enterprises. This wave of forced selling pushed down prices across the entire market. Great Western Railway shares, among the most prestigious in the land, plummeted 40%. And Great Western was one of the better companies. The smaller, more speculative lines saw their shares become effectively worthless overnight. And this is where George Hudson's house of cards finally collapses. Investigators and suspicious shareholders began demanding access to Hudson's account books. What they found was devastating. Dividends had been paid not from operating profits, but from the capital deposits of new investors. Account books had been doctored. Share registries had been manipulated to inflate Hudson's personal holdings. Entire railway companies under his control had been reporting profits that did not exist. The man they called the Railway King was revealed to be a con artist of extraordinary scale. He had not built an empire, he had built an illusion, and the entire railway market had been priced, in part, on that illusion. The psychological impact was seismic. If Hudson's companies were fraudulent, what about the others? How many more railway firms were hiding losses, cooking books, paying dividends from capital? The answer did not matter. What mattered was the question itself. Because in a financial system, trust is not just important, it is the oxygen. When trust disappears, the system suffocates. And in the autumn of 1847, trust evaporated like morning fog. Hudson himself would face disgrace, legal proceedings, parliamentary investigation, and eventual exile from the society that had once celebrated him. But his personal fate was irrelevant to the market. The damage was done. The exposure did not save the financial system. It accelerated the collapse by poisoning confidence in the entire railway sector. Think about that for a moment. One man's lies did not just destroy his own companies, they poisoned confidence in an entire sector, an entire technology. Now ask yourself, what happens when the first major artificial intelligence company admits its revenue projections were fantasy? When the first darling of the boom reveals that its business model cannot generate the returns its valuation demands? But the railways were only half the problem. The Bank of England is now in an impossible position. The economy is hemorrhaging. Businesses are failing. Banks are under siege from depositors demanding their money. The system desperately needs liquidity, more money flowing through the financial arteries to prevent a total seizure. But the Bank Charter Act forbids issuing more banknotes without gold backing, and the gold is gone, drained by famine relief, food imports, and capital flight. The law that was supposed to prevent crisis is now causing one. Peel's fortress has become a prison. The bank's only tool is the discount rate, the interest rate it charges on short-term loans. It raises the rate, trying to attract gold back to London. But higher rates make borrowing more expensive, which accelerates the very bankruptcies the bank is trying to prevent. Companies that might have survived with affordable credit are pushed over the edge by the cost of borrowing. It is a death spiral. The tighter the bank squeezes, the faster the economy bleeds. On April the 17th, the bank's reserves hit their absolute trough, the lowest point of the first phase of crisis. The bullion held against notes issued had fallen to levels that made seasoned bankers physically ill. The institution that was supposed to be the lender of last resort was itself running out of ammunition. There was a brief, deceptive respite. The government shifted the cost of famine relief from the imperial treasury to Irish local taxes, temporarily easing the gold drain from the Bank of England's vaults. For a few weeks, it seemed like the worst might be over, but the relief was illusory. The outflows from capital flight to America and grain imports from Europe overwhelmed the modest savings. The bleeding slowed, but it did not stop. Then October arrived, and with it came the terror. Bankruptcies are accelerating now. Smaller banks and brokerage firms are failing daily. Each morning, the City of London wakes to news of another collapse, another firm, another family's fortune gone. Reports arrive from Ireland that the potato blight has struck again, a second consecutive year of devastation. This means more government spending, more gold drain, more pressure on reserves that are already critically depleted. The trading floors of London have a new sound, not the frantic shouting of speculation, but a terrible, stunned quiet. The silence of men watching disaster unfold in real time and understanding, with perfect clarity, that there is nothing they can do to stop it. On October the 14th, a man walks into Hyde Park, one of London's most beautiful public spaces, a place of green lawns and autumn trees and children at play, and takes his own life. He is not the first person driven to such despair by the financial catastrophe. He will not be the last. The panic is no longer just destroying fortunes. It is destroying people. By mid-October, the crisis has reached a tipping point. The question is no longer whether the system will break, it is whether anything can stop it. Financiers, bankers, railway directors, men who weeks ago were among the wealthiest in the empire, are now begging the government to intervene. Literally begging. Letters flood Downing Street. Delegations arrive at the Chancellor's office in carriages, in groups of 5 and 10, powerful men who have never asked anyone for anything, now asking for everything. The message is the same everywhere. Suspend the Bank Act, or everything collapses. The government hesitates. Suspending the act would mean admitting the law was flawed, that Peel's great monetary reform, the cornerstone of conservative economic policy, was a failure. The political cost would be enormous. And so, for a few more days, nothing is done. And in those days, the panic metastasizes into something worse. What happened between October the 17th and October the 25th, 1847, would earn a name that still echoes through financial history. They called it the Week of Terror, and it was about to begin. It begins on a Sunday. London, late October. The autumn air is cold and damp, carrying the smell of coal smoke and the Thames. The financial district is quiet, the banks are closed, the trading floors empty. But behind closed doors, in the offices of the city's most important banking houses, men are working through the night, counting reserves, calculating exposure, reviewing the lists of firms that owe them money and wondering, praying, that those firms will still exist on Monday morning. Monday comes, and with it, the first shockwave. One of London's most respected banking houses announces the suspension of payments. The doors close, the depositors are turned away. The name that had stood for decades as a pillar of British finance is suddenly, violently, worthless. The news hits the city like a physical blow. If they can fail, anyone can fail. The reaction is immediate. Depositors at other banks rush to withdraw their money. Lines form outside banking halls before the doors are even open. The clatter of horse-drawn carriages rushing toward Threadneedle Street fills the narrow streets. Clerks shout over each other. Pale, stricken faces crowd the counters, clutching withdrawal slips, hoping, praying. They are not too late. Every person in that line knows the same terrible arithmetic. The bank does not have enough money for everyone. The only question is whether they are close enough to the front. Margin calls cascade through the system. Forced liquidations begin. Assets that were valued at thousands of pounds yesterday are being sold at fire sale prices today, pushing the market down further, triggering more margin calls, more liquidations. It is a machine of destruction, each gear turning the next. But this was only day one. Tuesday and Wednesday bring 2 more bank failures in rapid succession. The second and third dominoes fall, and each one shakes the entire structure harder. Each failure feeds the next. Bank A holds debt from Company B, which holds shares in Railway C, which owes money to Bank D. When one link in the chain breaks, the stress transfers instantly to every connected point. And in the City of London in 1847, everything is connected to everything. This is not a series of isolated collapses. This is a systemic event. The financial system of the British Empire, the most sophisticated financial system in the world, is eating itself alive. The discount rate climbs higher. Borrowing becomes nearly impossible. And now comes the cruelest feature of the panic. It does not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. Companies that are fundamentally sound, profitable, well-managed, built on genuine commerce rather than speculation, cannot access credit to meet their short-term obligations. A factory owner who never bought a single railway share cannot get a loan to pay his suppliers because his bank is hoarding every penny of cash it has. A shipping firm with full order books cannot finance its next voyage because the credit market has frozen solid. This is the cruelest feature of a financial panic. When liquidity vanishes, everyone drowns, the reckless speculator and the careful businessman alike. In a terraced house in one of London's respectable middle-class neighbourhoods, A family receives the news they have been dreading. The father, a merchant, a careful man, a man who believed in prudence and thrift, invested the family's savings in railway shares. Not recklessly, he thought. These were established companies, sound investments. Everyone said so. His banker said so. His colleagues said so. Now the shares are worthless. The capital calls are still legally due. Their home, put up as collateral, is seized. The children will be sent to relatives. The family's social standing, built over a lifetime of careful respectability, is obliterated in a morning. More than 450 firms would ultimately fail between August 1847 and December 1848. Each one of those failures is a story like this one, multiplied by hundreds, multiplied by thousands of families. And then came the moment that nearly broke the Bank of England itself. A major discount house, one of the firms that acted as an intermediary between the bank and the broader financial system, collapses. This is no longer a peripheral failure. This is a direct threat to the Bank of England's own balance sheet. The institution that is supposed to save everyone else now needs saving. The fourth major bank of the week suspends payments. 4 pillars of British finance, gone, in less than a week. The broader economy is seizing up. Trade credit has frozen. Supply chains are stalling. Businesses cannot pay workers or suppliers. Ships sit in harbour because no one will extend the credit needed to unload their cargo. Factories fall silent because raw materials cannot be purchased. The financial crisis is becoming an economic crisis, spreading from the City of London into every workshop, warehouse, and household in the country. The streets of London's financial district have the atmosphere of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. Shell-shocked men wander between buildings. Foreclosure notices flutter in the autumn wind, pinned to the doors of firms that were flourishing weeks ago. The silence between collapses is worse than the collapses themselves. It is the silence of waiting for the next blow to fall. The political dimension ignites. Delegations of city financiers descend on Downing Street. These are proud, powerful men. Men who normally dictate terms to politicians, not the other way around. Men who fund political campaigns and shape government policy from their private dining rooms. Now they are supplicants. They arrive at the Chancellor's office not with demands, but with desperation. Their message is simple and raw. If you do not act, the Bank of England will fall. And if the bank falls, the empire falls with it. What happened next defied all logic. But before the resolution came, there was the human cost. And it must not be forgotten, because behind the statistics and the bank failures and the policy debates, there are people, real people, with real lives, shattered in real time. This is where the story takes its darkest turn. The merchant who wagered everything is not alone. Across London, across the industrial cities of the Midlands and the North, across the market towns of rural England, families are being destroyed. A widow in Bath invested her late husband's military pension in railway shares on the advice of her banker, the same banker whose firm just collapsed. She has nothing. A clerk in Liverpool borrowed against his future wages to buy shares in a line that was never built. He owes more than he will earn in 10 years. Remember the sons of the charwoman who subscribed £37,500 in railway stock? Where are they now? They owe a fortune they never had, on shares worth a fraction of what they pledged. Their mother scrubbed floors so they could have better lives. The railway mania gave them a glimpse of wealth beyond imagination, and then snatched it away, leaving debts that will define the rest of their existence. The Victorian middle class had staked its identity on prudence, thrift, and steady accumulation. The panic of 1847 revealed that identity as a fiction. In a bubble, the prudent and the reckless are equally vulnerable. The careful man who invested 10% of his savings is destroyed just as surely as the gambler who invested everything, because the crash does not grade on a curve. The man in Hyde Park on October the 14th was not alone. The coroner's reports from these weeks tell a story that the financial histories often omit. Despair was not abstract. It was physical, final, and horrifyingly common. The panic of 1847 did not just destroy wealth. It destroyed lives in the most literal and irreversible sense. But in the corridors of power, a decision was being made that would change everything. The Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, who had succeeded Peel, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, faced an impossible choice. Option 1. Uphold the Bank Charter Act. Maintain the gold standard discipline. Let the market purge itself of speculation and fraud and excess. Accept the bankruptcies, accept the suffering. Trust that the economy will eventually find its footing. But risk, genuinely risk. Total systemic collapse. The Bank of England running out of reserves entirely. The cessation of all credit. An economic catastrophe that could shatter the empire itself. Option 2. Suspend the act. Allow the Bank of England to issue banknotes without full gold backing. Flood the system with liquidity. Save the banks, save the firms, save the economy. But in doing so, destroy the credibility of Peel's monetary framework. Admit that the law was fundamentally flawed. Reward the speculators and the fraudsters alongside the innocent. Create the precedent that, in a crisis, the government will always step in. A precedent that could encourage even greater recklessness in the future. This is the dilemma that haunts every financial crisis in history. Do you let the fire burn, hoping it purges the rot? Or do you douse it, knowing you might be rewarding the arsonists? Sound familiar? This is the exact argument that raged in 2008. Let Lehman Brothers fail and allow the market to correct, or bail out the entire banking system at taxpayer expense. And it is the argument we will hear again, perhaps sooner than anyone expects, if the artificial intelligence bubble bursts. Do you rescue the over-leveraged technology firms, or do you let the market correct, no matter the human cost? Russell and the Chancellor knew that if the Bank of England failed, their government would fall with it. The empire's financial credibility, the foundation upon which global trade and colonial power rested, would be shattered. The consequences were not just economic, they were geopolitical, they were civilizational, so they made their choice. On October the 25th, 1847, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer write a letter to the Governor of the Bank of England. The letter is short, it is direct. It authorizes the bank to issue banknotes beyond the limits set by the Bank Charter Act, to print money, without gold backing if necessary, to save the financial system. The legal constraint that had been strangling the economy for months is, with a stroke of a pen, suspended. That is it. A letter. Not a law passed by Parliament, not a royal decree sealed with wax, not a sweeping legislative reform debated over weeks. A letter. A few paragraphs on official stationery, signed by two men in a crisis. The letter reaches the Bank of England. The bank announces publicly that it has government authority to issue notes beyond the legal limit. The news spreads through the City of London within hours. And then, something extraordinary happens. The panic stops. Almost instantly. The mere knowledge that the bank could print money, that the constraint had been lifted, that liquidity would be available, if needed, was enough. Confidence flooded back into the market like air rushing into a vacuum. Depositors stopped withdrawing. Banks stopped failing. The cascading chain of collapse that had been accelerating for days simply ceased. Let that sink in. But here is the truly astonishing part. The Bank of England never actually had to issue the extra notes. The letter was never used. The suspension was never exercised. The emergency powers that had been granted were never invoked. Not a single banknote was printed beyond the original legal limit. A piece of paper that was never used ended the worst financial panic of the 19th century. Not gold, not a bailout, not soldiers in the streets. A promise. A credible, public, unambiguous promise that the government would do whatever it took to prevent systemic collapse. The promise alone was sufficient. History pivoted on a single letter, but the damage was already done. The panic had ended. The crisis had not. More than 450 firms had failed or would fail in the months that followed. Countless families were ruined. The middle class, the social backbone of Victorian Britain, was hollowed out. The recession that followed was deep and grinding. There was no rapid recovery, no triumphant bounce. Economic contraction persisted until 1850. Equity markets underperformed for years. The scars ran deep and healed slowly. But amid the wreckage, the railways survived. The tracks that had been laid during the mania were real. The bridges were real. The stations were real. The engineering was magnificent. The bubble destroyed the investors. It did not destroy the infrastructure. By 1850, Britain possessed the most advanced railway network on Earth, a network that would power its economic dominance for the next half-century. The speculators lost everything, and in doing so, they funded a revolution in transportation that benefited everyone who came after them. And there is one more irony. The railway construction had employed thousands of Irish labourers, navvies who had fled the famine in search of any work that would keep them alive. Capital was transferred, in effect, from reckless speculators to desperate labourers. It was an accidental redistribution of wealth, achieved through disaster. Now zoom forward 180 years. Replace steam with artificial intelligence. Replace railway shares with shares in technology companies whose valuations are built on the promise of a revolution that has not yet proven profitable at scale. Replace George Hudson with, well, pick your favorite technology executive promising revolutionary returns on a technology that burns cash faster than it generates revenue. The structural parallels are not subtle. Explosive speculation in genuinely transformative technology, credit-fueled expansion, over-optimism that dismisses every warning as the whining of skeptics who do not understand the future. External shock risks, interest rate hikes, geopolitical instability, the sudden realization that revenue projections were fantasies. One historical analysis explicitly compares the railway mania to the current boom in artificial intelligence. The initial hype, an early downturn that snuffs the first wave of mania, then a renewed frenzy fueled by cheaper credit and deeper conviction, then collapse. The critical question is not whether artificial intelligence will transform civilization. It will. Steam railways transformed civilization. That was never in doubt, even in 1847. The question is whether the investment bubble around artificial intelligence will destroy the people who bet on it before the transformation arrives, whether the speculators will survive long enough to see the world they are funding. In the 1840s, rigid monetary policy amplified the crisis. The Bank Charter Act strangled the economy at the worst possible moment. Today, central bank rate decisions and inflation-targeting frameworks could play the exact same role, tightening credit at precisely the wrong moment, turning a correction into a catastrophe. In the 1840s, a charismatic fraud at the center of the mania masked the rot in the entire sector. Today, the question is, how many artificial intelligence companies are paying dividends, delivering returns or growth metrics from unsustainable capital expenditure rather than genuine earnings? How many are Hudson's heirs, building empires of illusion on foundations of hype? Nobody can predict with certainty that a 2026 collapse will happen. The financial system today is different in important ways. More regulated, more diversified, with circuit breakers and intervention mechanisms the Victorians could not have imagined. But the human patterns are identical. Greed, overconfidence, the belief that this technology is so transformative that normal valuation rules do not apply. The social pressure to invest, the fear of missing out that drove charwomen's sons to subscribe for £37,500 in railway stock. History does not need to repeat exactly, it just needs to rhyme. But the battle's end was just the beginning of the reckoning. The full inventory of destruction is staggering when laid out in its totality. More than 450 firms collapsed between August 1847 and December 1848. 4 major banks failed during the week of terror alone. Gold reserves at the Bank of England dropped from £15 million to £9 million. Great Western Railway shares, among the most prestigious securities in the land, lost 40% of their value. Credit via loans and deposits had expanded 5-fold in just 2 years during the mania, creating an edifice of leverage that collapsed with sickening speed when confidence evaporated. Consols fell to levels not seen in decades. No other panic was ever so fatal to the middle class. That sentence, written by a historian studying the aftermath, deserves to sit in silence for a moment, because it is not a statistic, it is a verdict. The people who were supposed to be protected by prudence, by thrift, by the fundamental stability of the British financial system, they were the ones who were destroyed. Not the aristocrats, who had land and titles to fall back on. Not the working poor, who had nothing to lose. The middle class. The people who had saved and invested and believed that the system would reward their discipline. They were the ones who paid the price. The recession that followed was neither brief nor merciful. Economic contraction ground on until 1850. There was no swift recovery. Equity markets underperformed for years. The psychological damage, the shattered trust in financial institutions, in railway companies, in the very idea that technology could be a safe foundation for investment, lasted a generation. But amid the wreckage, something remarkable was happening. The railway infrastructure survived. The bubble destroyed investors. It did not destroy the railways. By 1850, Britain possessed the most advanced railway network on Earth. The tracks laid during the mania crossed the length and breadth of the country, connecting cities, towns, ports, and factories in a web of iron and steam that would become the circulatory system of the world's greatest industrial economy. The bridges were real. The stations were real. The tunnels carved through hillsides were real. The engineering was not just competent, it was magnificent, built to last, and it did last. Many of those lines are still in use today. The speculators lost everything, and in doing so, they funded a revolution in transportation that benefited everyone who came after them. The people who built the future were not the people who profited from it. The railway navvies who laid the track, many of them Irish, fleeing famine, working for wages that kept them alive, they survived. The investors who employed them were ruined. The infrastructure endured. The money did not. The crisis also catalyzed policy innovations that would shape the next century of monetary thinking. Debates sparked by the panic informed the development of central banking theory, currency board systems like Earl Grey's reforms in Mauritius, and the ongoing intellectual war between those who believed the Bank Charter Act proved the need for stricter monetary control and those who believed it proved the opposite. And this is the part that matters most for the parallel with artificial intelligence. The Panic of 1847 is not merely a historical curiosity, it is a template, not a prophecy. History does not make prophecies, but a pattern language, a vocabulary of cause and effect that repeats in recognizable rhythms across centuries and technologies. The template looks like this. Step 1. A genuinely transformative technology emerges. Step 2. Speculation outpaces the technology's actual revenue-generating capacity. Step 3. Credit expansion amplifies the bubble beyond anything the underlying technology can justify. Step 4. External shocks, a gold drain, interest rate hikes, a geopolitical event, trigger a liquidity crunch. Step 5. A rigid policy framework, whether it is the Bank Charter Act or modern inflation targeting, prevents the flexible response the crisis demands. Step 6. A charismatic fraudster or overhyped leader is exposed, destroying confidence not just in their company but in the entire sector. Step 7. Panic, collapse, human devastation on a massive scale. Step 8. Eventually, the technology survives and transforms the world anyway, but the investors who funded the bubble are ruined. If this pattern holds for artificial intelligence, then the technology will survive any crash. Artificial intelligence will still transform civilization. The algorithms will still reshape industries. The capabilities will still advance. But the speculative bubble around it, the trillion-dollar valuations, the venture capital frenzy, the retail investors pouring retirement savings into technology stocks on the assumption that the only direction is up, may not survive. And the human cost, the middle-class investors, the pension funds, the ordinary people who believed the hype because the technology was real and the future seemed inevitable, may be devastating. So, what do we actually learn from 1847? We must be epistemically honest. No historical source predicts a 2026 artificial intelligence collapse with certainty. The analogy has limits. The financial system today is genuinely different from the one that existed in Victorian Britain. Modern economies have circuit breakers, deposit insurance, coordinated central bank interventions, and regulatory frameworks that the Victorians could not have conceived. The Bank of England in 1847 had essentially one tool, the discount rate. Modern central banks have dozens, but the human patterns are identical. Greed does not need a new invention, it just needs a new costume. Overconfidence in revolutionary technology. The social pressure to invest. The terror of being left behind while everyone else gets rich. The willingness to ignore warning signs because acknowledging them means admitting you might lose everything. The belief, the fervent, almost religious belief, that this technology is so powerful, so transformative, so unprecedented, that normal rules of financial gravity simply do not apply. The lesson of 1847 is not that artificial intelligence will crash in 2026. The lesson is this: when a bubble is driven by real technology, it is harder to see, harder to resist, and more devastating when it bursts. Because the believers are not wrong about the technology. They are wrong about the timing, the valuation, and their own ability to survive the correction. Remember where we started. A single letter ended the worst financial panic of the 19th century. A promise that was never fulfilled. A suspension that was never exercised. The power of a credible commitment to act was greater than any actual action. The question for our era is, who writes the letter this time? And will it come in time? The Panic of 1847 is not one of history's famous crises. It does not have the name recognition of the Great Depression or the crash of 2008. It does not feature in popular culture or dominate the chapters of economics textbooks, but in many ways, it was the prototype, the original template for every technology-driven financial collapse that followed. The debates it spawned are the same debates we have after every crisis. Was it caused by too much regulation or too little? Too much credit or insufficient reserves? Individual fraud or systemic failure? Reckless speculation or inevitable growing pains? Monetarists claimed the Bank Charter Act vindicated their theories. Their opponents claimed it did the opposite. Austrian economists saw confirmation of the dangers of credit expansion. Banking school advocates saw proof that rigid monetary rules were worse than the diseases they claimed to cure. The answer, as always, is all of the above. Crises are never monocausal. They are the product of systems, technological, financial, psychological, political, interacting in ways that no single theory can fully capture. But the universal pattern endures. Every transformative technology in human history has generated a speculative bubble. Canals in the 18th century, railways in the 19th, electricity, radio, automobiles, the internet in the 1990s, cryptocurrency in the 2010s, and now, artificial intelligence. The pattern is always the same. The technology is real, the speculation is insane, the crash is devastating, and the technology survives to change the world anyway. The people who build the future are rarely the people who profit from it. The railway navvies who laid the track survived. The investors who funded them were destroyed. The engineers who designed the locomotives endured. The shareholders who bought at the peak did not. The engineers and researchers who are building artificial intelligence systems today will endure. The question is whether the investors, the funds, the retirement accounts, the ordinary people who have poured their savings into the promise of a technological revolution will endure alongside them. So the next time someone tells you that artificial intelligence is different, that this time the valuations are justified, that this technology is so powerful it transcends the rules of financial gravity, remember the railway king, remember the charwoman's sons, remember the man in Hyde Park, remember the 450 firms, remember the middle-class families who believed that progress and profit were the same thing, and learned too late that they were not. In 1847, a single letter, a few sentences written by a prime minister, stopped the annihilation of the British financial system, a promise that was never fulfilled, a suspension that was never exercised. The most powerful intervention in the history of 19th century finance was a piece of paper that was never used. The age of steam did not end that day. It was just beginning. But the age of believing that steam could make everyone rich, that ended in a single week. We are living in the age of artificial intelligence. The technology is real. The transformation is coming. It may be the most significant technological shift in human history, but so, perhaps, is the reckoning. And when it comes, if it comes, the question will not be whether artificial intelligence survives. It will. The question will be, do you? History does not repeat, but it remembers. And right now, it is whispering.